There's a strange moment some people experience but rarely talk about. It happens in the quiet, in the pause between conversations, in that space where the world feels loud even when no one is speaking. It's the moment when a person realizes they feel more at ease with distance than with closeness. Not because they dislike humanity in some grand rebellious way, but because being around people feels heavier than it should. It drains them, confuses them, or even makes them question themselves. And if you've ever felt that tug of reluctance before stepping into a room filled with chatter, if you've ever chosen the long way home just to avoid bumping into someone, or if you've ever felt a strange kind of pressure when someone asks you a simple question, then you already know the feeling I'm talking about. It's not hatred. Not really. It's something more complex, more layered. Something people rarely admit out loud. Some individuals don't dislike people. They dislike what people bring out in them. They dislike the roles they feel forced to play, the expectations, the subtle emotional math they must constantly perform. Adjust this part of themselves, hide that part, soften this truth, make that expression. Every moment becomes a negotiation between authenticity and acceptance. And for some people, that negotiation becomes exhausting. To understand the psychology behind this, you have to go deeper than the usual explanations. It's too easy to say someone is simply introverted or socially reserved. The truth is more nuanced. Many people who claim they dislike people are often some of the most observant, sensitive, or thoughtful individuals alive. They don't dislike people in the literal sense. They dislike the emotional labor attached to interacting with them. Think about it. When someone walks into a crowded room, their mind doesn't just register faces, it registers signals. The tone in someone's voice, the tension in someone's posture, the subtle shifts in energy. Some individuals process all of this rapidly and intensely. They absorb too much. They notice too much. And noticing too much can make the world feel overwhelmingly loud. It's similar to standing in front of 100 screens, all playing a different channel, all demanding attention. Most people don't experience the world that way, so they don't understand how draining it can be. There is a concept in psychology called emotional overstimulation. Not a disorder, not a flaw, simply a form of heightened sensitivity. People who experience this often find themselves needing more space than others. They aren't avoiding humanity. They're preserving themselves. They've learned that too much emotional input from the outside world makes their internal world unstable. So, they pull away, not as a rejection, but as self-regulation. But there's another layer to this story, one that goes deeper than sensitivity. Some individuals feel disconnected from people because people have been a source of confusion or disappointment in their past. Not in a dramatic way, but in subtle cumulative ways that leave an imprint. Maybe they learned early on that conversations often come with hidden meanings. Maybe they experienced situations where kindness felt conditional, where people said one thing but meant another, where trust felt like something that could be taken away without warning. Over time, the safest place becomes distance. Not isolation, distance, a buffer, a small emotional space where they can breathe without feeling watched, judged, or misunderstood. And then there's the expectation that society places on all of us. The expectation to be endlessly friendly, endlessly patient, endlessly accessible. For some people, this expectation feels artificial. They aren't naturally energized by casual interactions or small talk. They prefer depth. They prefer truth. They want conversations with meaning, not exchanges performed out of obligation. And because those kinds of conversations are rare, they often choose solitude over shallow connection, not out of dislike for humanity, but out of preference for authenticity. This leads to a fascinating psychological paradox. Many people who claim to dislike people actually crave connection, just not the kind of connection they usually get. They want conversations where no one is pretending. They want relationships where silence is comfortable. They want honesty without fear, closeness without pressure, affection without performance. These things exist, of course, but not everywhere, not with everyone. So until they find the few who understand, they settle into solitude as a temporary shelter. Another layer to this psychology is something called protective detachment. It happens when someone learns consciously or unconsciously that lowering their guard comes with emotional cost. So they create a barrier, not a wall made out of anger, but a shield made out of caution. They move through the world quietly, carefully, observing more than they participate. They appear distant, uninterested, or even cold. But inside their mind, there is a constant evaluation happening. Is this safe? Is this genuine? Will this drain me? If the answer feels uncertain, they step back, and stepping back becomes a habit. What makes this even more interesting is that these individuals often have a strong inner world. Their thoughts are vivid. Their imaginations are deep. They reflect more than most people realize. And because their inner world is rich, the outer world feels less necessary. It's not that they reject connection, it simply doesn't compete with the comfort of their own thoughts. Their solitude isn't empty. It's full of ideas, memories, reflections, possibilities. So when someone tries to pull them out of this inner world too quickly, they feel disrupted rather than included. There's a quiet truth here that many people rarely acknowledge. Solitude feels safe to those who have learned that being misunderstood is more painful than being alone. And for people who experience the world with heightened perception, misunderstanding is almost guaranteed. People misread their silence as coldness. They misread their calmness as disinterest. They misread their distance as rejection. In reality, these individuals are often the ones who care the most. They just express it differently. They care from afar, with thoughtfulness, rather than noise. But here's something important to understand about the psychology of people who feel this way. They don't want to live in permanent distance. They want closeness. They just want a form of closeness that doesn't drain them. They want relationships that allow them to stay themselves without constantly adjusting who they are. They want people who understand that silence is not a sign of discomfort, but a sign of comfort. They want presence without pressure. And deep down, they hope to find someone who can see through their calm exterior and recognize the depth underneath. People like this crave emotional freedom more than anything else. Freedom to feel, to think, to express themselves in ways that don't require performance. And because that kind of freedom is rare, they protect themselves until they find it. You might think this tendency to dislike people, or more accurately to avoid people, stems from negative experiences alone. But interestingly, research shows the opposite can also be true. Some individuals become overwhelmed by people not because they were hurt by them, but because they're simply wired to be introspective. Their default state is inward. They gain clarity from reflection, not conversation. They recharge in quiet spaces. They access creativity through solitude. For them, social interaction is like visiting a busy street. Interesting, stimulating even, but not a place to live. Another fascinating psychological aspect is the difference between stimulation thresholds. Some people thrive in energetic environments because their threshold for external stimulation is high. Others reach that threshold quickly. Their mind becomes crowded. Their emotions become cluttered. They need silence the same way others need music. They need stillness the same way others need movement. Asking them to socialize constantly is like asking someone to run a marathon every day. They could do it, but the cost would be tremendous. However, even as all of this makes sense, there's still a deeper question worth exploring. Why do some people express this feeling as "I dislike people"? Why phrase it that way? Why use such broad language for something so nuanced? Because for many of them, it's easier to blame the world than to explain their own complexity. It is easier to say, "People drain me," than to say, "I feel overwhelmed by the layers beneath every interaction." It is easier to say, "I like being alone," than to say, "I don't know how to connect without losing pieces of myself." It is easier to say, "I dislike people," than to say, "I struggle to feel safe in spaces where I can't fully be myself." But here's the quiet secret. Most individuals who say they dislike people are incredibly compassionate. Not loud compassion, not public compassion, but quiet compassion. They care deeply about fairness, about respect, about sincerity. They get affected by things others overlook. They feel emotions in high resolution. Their heart works over time, even when their face shows nothing. There's also a unique kind of self-awareness in people like this. They analyze their own reactions. They question their own discomfort. They examine their fears, their hesitations, their patterns. They don't move through life on autopilot. They move through life with introspection, constantly asking themselves why they feel what they feel. And sometimes that awareness itself becomes overwhelming. They feel too much inside to handle too much outside. But here's something often overlooked. Many people who dislike people actually love humanity in a broader sense. They love human stories, human creativity, human resilience. They love observing people from a distance, understanding how minds work, learning what shapes a person's identity. They simply struggle with the up-close interactions, the emotional demands, the unpredictable nature of personal relationships. They love humans as a concept. They struggle with humans as a responsibility. And in many ways, this makes them incredibly thoughtful. They don't enter relationships casually. They don't pretend to be connected when they're not. If they choose someone, friend, partner, or otherwise, it's because they feel genuinely safe with them. That's why their circle is small. Not because they dislike people, but because they value authenticity so deeply that only a few truly fit. What's remarkable is that people with this mindset often become extraordinary listeners when they trust someone. Their quietness makes them attentive. Their introspection makes them empathetic. Their caution makes them gentle. They may not engage with many, but with the few they trust, they offer a connection that is profound. But before they reach that point, they must navigate the world with an internal struggle that few notice. On one hand, they feel safer alone. On the other, they long for understanding. On one hand, they want to protect their peace. On the other, they wish they could experience closeness without feeling drained. They balance solitude and connection like a tightrope, constantly trying not to fall too far into either side. And somewhere deep inside, they hope for a moment, a person, an experience, a conversation that makes them rethink everything they believed about connection. Something that makes closeness feel lighter, safer, more natural. Something that proves that not everyone takes energy. Some people give it. Not everyone overwhelms. Some people bring calm. Not everyone confuses. Some people bring clarity. Until then, they carry this quiet, emotional truth. Disliking people isn't really about people. It's about protection. It's about energy. It's about understanding their own limits. It's about preserving the parts of themselves that feel too fragile to expose. And if anyone ever truly understood what goes on inside their mind, they'd realize something surprising. These individuals don't push people away because they feel nothing. They push people away because they feel everything. There comes a point in every person's life, when they begin to wonder whether their distance from others is a choice or a shield, a preference or a pattern. People who often say they dislike people eventually reach this moment of self-reflection, usually late at night when the world is quiet enough for honest thoughts to surface. It's the moment when they ask themselves why being alone feels so natural while being surrounded feels so exhausting, why small talk feels like work, why interaction feels like expectation, why conversations that others enjoy feel like emotional puzzles they must solve. For many, the answer lies in the stories they rarely tell. Everyone carries a set of experiences that have shaped their view of connection. Some people learned that opening up meant being misunderstood. Others learned that expressing their needs meant being dismissed. Some were criticized for their personality. Others were punished for their honesty. Over time, these small emotional injuries accumulate, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, persistent way, like drops of water carving a river through stone. And without even realizing it, they begin to associate people with discomfort. But discomfort alone doesn't explain the full picture. There's another dimension, something more subtle and psychological. Some people simply require a different kind of social nourishment than the world typically provides. They don't thrive on crowds or noise or a constantly shifting atmosphere. They crave depth, not volume. They crave authenticity, not performance. They crave spaces where they don't have to negotiate their identity. And because these spaces are rare, they retreat into themselves, not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. It's similar to someone who has a very specific dietary need. They can't eat what everyone else eats, not because they dislike food, but because not all food feels good for them. In the same way, not all social interactions feel good for everyone. Some drain energy, some create tension, some force them into roles that feel unnatural, so they avoid the emotional equivalent of unhealthy meals. And people mistake this for misanthropy. There's also something unique about the internal world of people who feel this way. Their inner voice is loud, thoughtful, analytical. They don't just experience emotions, they dissect them. They don't just observe behavior, they interpret it. And this constant analysis creates a sense of emotional fatigue. When your mind is always working, always processing, always noticing subtleties that others ignore, the presence of people becomes mentally demanding. Imagine someone who sees details most people don't, not because they want to, but because they can't help it. They notice a flicker of disappointment in someone's eyes, a small shift in tone, a hesitation, an unspoken expectation. They detect the tiniest inconsistencies in behavior. And while this sensitivity makes them highly perceptive, it also makes them highly affected. The world feels heavy because nothing slips through unnoticed. This leads to something psychologists call anticipatory regulation. It's when someone adjusts themselves before a situation even happens. They imagine possible outcomes, potential misunderstandings, emotional risks, conversational demands. They rehearse interactions inside their mind, analyzing how to respond to every possibility. And by the time they actually speak to someone, they have already spent a tremendous amount of energy preparing for it. No wonder socializing feels tiring. Yet, here's the part people rarely see. Individuals who function this way often long for ease. They long for relationships where they don't have to rehearse their emotions. They long for moments where they don't have to filter themselves. They long for people who understand silence, who understand depth, who understand the way their mind works. It's not that they want to be alone forever. They just don't want to feel overwhelmed while trying to be close. But even with this longing, they've developed a quiet resilience. They've learned how to be their own companion, how to take care of themselves without needing constant validation. how to enjoy their own thoughts, how to create a world inside their own mind where they feel understood. And because they have cultivated this solitude so deeply, any connection that disrupts it must be meaningful enough to be worth the disruption. One of the most misunderstood things about people who say they dislike people is that they rarely dislike individuals. They dislike the environment the people create. They dislike chaos. They dislike emotional inconsistency. They dislike unpredictability. They dislike situations where they have to constantly guess what someone means. They dislike the version of themselves they feel forced to become around others. And paradoxically, because of this, they often connect best with people who don't demand anything from them, people who don't take their stillness personally, people who don't interpret their distance as rejection, people who offer presence rather than pressure. With those individuals, they open up naturally, effortlessly, even beautifully. Their softness appears, their humor emerges, their intelligence shines, their vulnerability becomes visible. The right people don't make them feel drained. They make them feel understood. But reaching that point requires something these individuals rarely give themselves: patience. Patience with their own discomfort. Patience with their own patterns. Patience with the slow process of trust. Many of them are so used to self-reliance that they forget. Connection is supposed to build gradually, not instantly. They assume that if they don't feel safe right away, it means something is wrong. But safety is not a lightning strike. It's a slow, growing fire. It takes time. There's also a need for relearning. People who avoid others often operate based on old emotional rules, ones created by past experiences that no longer reflect their current life. Maybe they learned to stay quiet because speaking up once caused conflict. Maybe they learned to withdraw because someone once mocked their feelings. Maybe they learned to hide their true personality because showing it once led to rejection. These rules keep them protected, but they also keep them disconnected. At some point, they must examine whether these emotional rules still apply. And here is a surprising truth. Many of these individuals are not antisocial at all. They are profoundly social, but only under the right conditions. They value loyalty deeply. They value sincerity intensely. They value emotional safety more than almost anything. And when they find these things, they become some of the most committed and emotionally generous people you'll ever meet. But until then, they exist in a kind of emotional limbo. They don't seek chaos. They don't seek crowds. They don't seek superficial relationships. They move quietly through life, carefully choosing who gets access to their world. Not because they think too highly of themselves, but because they've learned how much it costs to let someone in. There is also something poetic about these people. Their emotions run deep. Their minds wander into places many never visit. They find meaning in silence, beauty and simplicity, comfort in solitude. They think before they speak. They analyze before they react. They observe before they judge. And while the world often rewards loudness, they are powered by depth. If you spend time with someone like this, you begin to notice something subtle. They experience life in slow motion, not literally, but emotionally. They feel things deeply before expressing them. They reflect before responding. They internalize before engaging. And this slow emotional processing can make fast-paced social situations feel overwhelming. It's like asking a painter to finish a masterpiece in 5 minutes. It's not impossible, but it goes against their natural rhythm. And their rhythm matters. Everyone moves through the world at a different emotional speed. Some thrive in rapid exchanges. Others require time. People who think they dislike people are often just people who move at a slower emotional pace. When forced into faster rhythms, they lose balance. When allowed to move slowly, they flourish. Another major piece of this psychology comes from the way they interpret emotions, both their own and others. Many individuals in this category are highly empathetic, but not in the conventional sense. Their empathy is not loud or public. It's quiet and internal. They feel other people's emotions almost as if they were their own. And because empathy is energy, feeling too much drains them. It's not people they dislike. It's the emotional overflow that people unintentionally bring. And so they create boundaries that look like distance. They protect their emotional bandwidth. They choose where to invest their attention. They pull back when their inner world becomes too full. This isn't rejection. It's emotional management. But here's the irony. The more they protect themselves, the more misunderstood they become. People assume they are cold or indifferent, but indifference is the opposite of what they feel. If anything, they feel too much, too intensely, too deeply. And because they don't always express it, their depth becomes invisible. The world doesn't often reward quietness. It misinterprets it. It overlooks it. It forgets it. But quiet people are not empty. They are overflowing. Their silence is not a lack of thought, but a lack of noise. Their distance is not a rejection of others, but an embrace of themselves. And yet, beneath all of this, there exists an unspoken hope. A hope that one day they won't feel the need to defend their energy. A hope that they will find people who bring peace rather than pressure. A hope that connection will feel like warmth instead of obligation. I hope that the right person will understand that their silence is a form of trust, not withdrawal. That their distance is a form of self-protection, not disinterest. That their solitude is a form of healing, not rejection. Because people who dislike people don't actually want to live behind emotional walls forever. They want someone who knocks gently, someone who stays long enough for the wall to lower on its own. Someone who doesn't rush their openness. Someone who understands that their heart is slow to trust because it is careful, not because it is closed. And slowly, when the right connection enters their life, something begins to shift. The world feels a little less loud. Conversations feel a little less demanding. The emotional weight becomes lighter. They begin to laugh more freely, speak more openly, share more honestly. Their inner world, once guarded, becomes a place they allow someone else to witness. That is the true psychology behind people who say they dislike people. It is not a rejection of humanity. It is a longing for the right humanity. It is not emotional coldness. It is emotional sensitivity. It is not aloofness. It is self-preservation. It is not judgment. It is discernment. And maybe, just maybe, if the world understood this, fewer people would feel the need to hide behind distance. They wouldn't be labeled as antisocial or unfriendly. They would be seen for what they truly are: thoughtful, sensitive, perceptive individuals navigating a world that often moves too loudly, too quickly, too carelessly for their inner rhythm. Because deep down, even the most distant person carries a simple desire: to be understood without having to explain everything, to be accepted without having to perform, to be cared for without having to exhaust themselves.